Alright, welcome back. So this is going to be part 2 of talking about orthotics and me just trying to teach this information to myself. I've had this information on the whiteboard for almost a week now because I think it was last Thursday when I recorded the other video and today's the following Thursday. But I am excited to finally go through all of the specific types of splints that may correlate with various conditions. So again, I know I already listed the disclaimer at the beginning of this video that written out, but as far as the format goes for this, I kind of liked how the Missing Piece OT PDF kind of laid it out by like joint or body part. So anytime, the only thing about doing it that way is that you kind of see the same condition under different joints or body parts, which makes sense. So that was kind of the hard part with conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, for example, because it's listed under wrist, hand, and thumb. I'm like, well, yeah, duh. Like, I feel like it could just be under hand, but whenever I'm seeing it just strictly about the wrist or strictly about the thumb here, I'm just going to be mentioning that small part of the resting hand splint. Normally, I would just put it under hand and call it good, call it a day, it's fine. But I was kind of just writing out all of the conditions as listed from the PDFs just to kind of help me facilitate my active recall strategies. And on that note, about active recall, that's why this has taken me a whole week to get to this point, so I'm just going to go through it and kind of rapid fire list off the conditions and anything you might need to know about the orthotic, at least that I could find in my studying and my active recall. I do have a cheat sheet here. I'm going to try not to use it. This is just what it looks like. This is kind of what I do for active recall. I combine it with writing because handwriting does help you memorize or really remember what you're studying. So, yeah, there's that. There's my cheat sheet. I'm also going to keep a dry erase marker here. Where's the camera? There it is. I'm just going to go over here and check off the conditions like every few or so or whatever. I'm not sure how often I'll do it, but just to kind of help keep track of it, since really the only thing on the camera screen here is going to be the whiteboard, and it's hardly ever going to change unless I raise or lower the tripod. And then I have my orthotics back in this video in case I need to bring it up, and just kind of a good reminder in case you haven't seen the other video. So, to go ahead and get started, I have this whiteboard split up into 6 different joints and or body parts. So there's wrist, thumb, hand, elbow, finger, and the shoulder. And right next to each joint or body part has general types of orthotics that you may see to help stabilize or mobilize the wrist, for example, or that body part or joint. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every condition listed under that body part or joint has to be one of those 4 or one of the 2 types of general splints. There are potentially others that are there as well. Again, this format started from the PDFs on the Missing Piece OT, but I've added to it. I've not really rearranged it, but it's a little different, but the formatting is more or less there from Kim's PDFs. Again, give credit to where credit is due. That's why I'm saying this. So to get started, Sarah, no cheat sheet. It's only there if I feel like I need it. Because again, this is about active recall. So for carpal tunnel syndrome, you're as far as positioning goes with that, you're going to keep it in a neutral wrist. I feel like I'm missing something. I feel like I'm being put on the spot with the video here. Oh, that's literally all about it. Okay, yeah. Keep the wrist in a neutral position in a wrist cock-up splint. And the whole idea is that it's to reduce the tension on the median nerve. So, something like this wrist cock-up splint. Probably not a dorsal wrist cock-up splint, but that is kind of what kind of example of what you would use for that. Radial nerve palsy or forearm level radial nerve repair. That's going to look similar to that of carpal tunnel syndrome. You're going to be in a wrist cock-up splint, but instead of a neutral wrist, you want to keep the wrist in a extended position, because in radial nerve palsy, your hand is going to have that wrist drop position. It's going to be hard to extend. But if your doctor goes in and does some sort of surgery on it, it won't be in that position anymore. But when you go to position it, you want to make sure that you reduce that tension on the radial nerve, which runs along the dorsal side of the arm and the hand. Now, if you think about in that wrist drop position, because that radial nerve is on the dorsal side of the hand, it's kind of awkward here in front of the camera, it has to stretch all the way across that wrist and down the hand. That could cause a little bit of pain or nerve pain for you. We'll let this refocus. There we go. So you want to keep it in that about 20 to 30 degrees of wrist extension for radial nerve palsy, forearm level radial nerve repair. Our next one is rheumatoid arthritis. This was that weird example I gave earlier. We're like, yeah, it's underhand. Why can't we just call it resting hand splint is good enough? But it's just, I think it's just under all those three different ones to get us to thinking about the specific parts of the splint, so you don't forget it. Just kind of splitting it up, I guess. I don't know how to describe it. I hope that makes sense. But with RA at the wrist, the goal is to gradually increase the range of motion of wrist extension to 30 degrees. RA is one of those things, you want to focus on comfort, but it's not going to be as much to the extent as CRPS, as we'll talk about here in a moment. But just be careful with it. You might not start with 30 degrees, but you can eventually get up to that point. So maybe a serial static splint would be good for that, because you want to maintain whatever range of motion that they do have, and that would be worn during flare-ups, I believe. Oh, wait, no, well, not necessarily. But I'll go ahead and move on to the next one. So tendinosis, I remember seeing it. That one is definitely would be worn during flare-ups as well. Tendinosis, just think of as the chronic version of tendinitis. It's just when that tendinitis, the inflammation on the tendon, has been around for a long time, that over 3 or 6 months, and there's a little bit of scarring in there, and flare-ups generally flare-ups do mean inflammation. Tendinitis is that acute inflammation, but tendinosis is more that chronic conditions. You can still have those flare-ups where inflammation does occur, so the time when you would wear a splint with tendinosis would be whenever there is those flare-ups, when there is inflammation that flares up. Sorry, I keep saying the same thing over and over again. And the actual positioning for tendinosis is going to be that 20 to 30 degrees of wrist extension. Wrist fracture. This one I always keep getting stumped on. I don't want to look at the cheat sheet, but I am. I get stumped on this one for no reason. Alright, so, okay, another little disclaimer with this. Not every single one of the conditions on here you're going to be making a splint for the client. You're always going to be getting a referral from the doctor. It'll generally say what positioning to put them in. That will kind of tell you the orthotic you need to make, or kind of help you make the decision to get a prefabricated splint. I talked more about that in the previous video about orthotics. Yeah. But anyway, so a wrist fracture, they're generally going to be they are going to be starting with an immobilization phase as the beginning of their protocol from their doctor. So fractures are generally going to go immobilization to active range of motion to passive range of motion, and then eventually to strengthening, generally about 8 weeks. but we're not talking about progression right now. But there's going to be some sort of immobilization splint, but we do expect to see an increase in range of motion. So you might consider like a serial static splint, maybe a dynamic splint, some sort of mobilizing splint. But absolutely no passive range of motion, especially early on. And then, what's next? CRPS, or chronic regional pain syndrome. This one, what I got out of reading about this one on the PDFs and this one textbook that I've gotten a lot of information from as well that I have, was talking about really being cautious about the client's comfort. So ideally, I don't want to get this too mixed up with. Okay, this is another one. It's also listed under hand. So ideally, you're going to be in a resting hand splint. So if we narrow that into the wrist, because we are talking specifically about the wrist here, ideally you want to get them to be in that 20 to 30 degrees of wrist extension, but they may not be able to get that far right away. The pain might be restricting their range of motion. And then for stroke, this is kind of a new one I found. I kind of wanted to look. Oh, no, I did look this one up, didn't I? I try to look up pictures of splints just to make sure I know them. So for stroke, you're going to use a splint with more of a serpentine design. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but the point of, or what it means, but what it looks like, or why it's called that, I should say. It kind of looks like a wrist cock-up splint in a way, but it's not a wrist cock-up splint. But the purpose of a serpentine design splint is to reduce spasticity or tone, like a high tone in a client. I remember reading specifically for mild and moderate tone. And also maybe not severe tone, because it'd just be too difficult and just not feasible to get someone with high tone, super high severe tone into a splint. Just like I've heard about from a fieldwork educator about just resting hand splint for flaccidity is just not feasible, which I did read that recently in that textbook too. So it's not just because it's not feasible, you don't do it. I guess it's advised against based on evidence. Now for a median nerve repair, I think I wrote that in a different section here, but I think I know it. So for median nerve repair, was this the elbow level median nerve repair? I think. But generally speaking, the rule of thumb is to think about the tension of the nerve. So with median nerve repair, I know for chronic, or why did I say that? I know for carpal tunnel, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's going to be in a neutral wrist position. But I've also read for median nerve repair, which that's different from carpal tunnel syndrome. I guess carpal tunnel repair might be different from a neutral wrist as well, but I haven't seen that anywhere in this studying. But for a median nerve repair, like at the elbow, for example, as well, you want to have the wrist in about 30 degrees of wrist flexion, because that's going to reduce the tension on the median nerve, because the median nerve does run along the volar side of the forearm and the wrist. If you stretch here, which makes sense, because if you stretch your arm back behind you like this, I know that's in front of me, but if you stretch it back like that, that's a lot of tension on the median nerve, and that is a median nerve tensioner. Not glide, but tensioner exercise that one can do. Not all therapists like it, but it's still a tensioner. So, positioning after median nerve repair, about 30 degrees of wrist flexion. And then ulnar nerve repair, this is the one where you want to be cautious of claw hand deformity. That is the hyperextension of the 4th and 5th digit MCPs. And there's going to be some flexion at the PIPs and DIPs as well. So with the ulnar nerve repair, you also want to keep in about 23 degrees of wrist flexion, but you want to have your 4th and 5th digits no more than 45 degrees of MCP extension. I hope you can see that, to prevent claw hand deformity. So that ends the wrist. Let me go ahead and check all these in case someone out there is skipping ahead. Oh, I forgot distal radius fracture. Let me do that. So, distal radius fracture. Again, it's a fracture. They're going to be starting in an immobilization phase. They're going to eventually progress active range motion, then passive range motion, then strengthening. So, normally I would think the splint you'd put them in is an immobilization splint. But I was in a navigating questions session with mentor Kim with the missing piece OT, and there was a content question about distal radius fracture. Like, since they're recently getting at, well, also this might have just been the time that the client was in this example question, but in the case, they're just getting out of cast and they're going to be stiff. So what do we need to do if they're going to be stiff? We don't want to immobilize them because that's just going to keep them stiff or make them even more stiff. We want to mobilize them. So the answer there was a dynamic splint on that sample question. But they're still going to start in that immobilization phase. So I guess it would initially start with a wrist cock-up splint. But like what we know about wrist stiffness just as a whole in general, and what I've talked about with, I think it's the wrist fracture. If you expect to see an increase in range of motion, then consider a serial static splint, where you can mold the splint to the client's wrist, and arm, and then do your therapy for a few sessions, come back, get the measurements again. It's like, oh yeah, you're too good for this current position of the splint. Let's remold the splint. You can review the principles of the material in the previous video. That makes it easy to remold the material. And we will remold it to the client's hand and wrist and arm, with an increased range of motion. So I feel like a serial static splint would be good. The answer there was dynamic, which is also a mobilization splint, but the ultimate goal is to mobilize with fractures once it's safe to do so, obviously. Let me go ahead and check mark that one. Alright, next I'm going to talk about the thumb. I think this is one of the easiest ones to remember, or I pretty much had most of these memorized already, or half. But for Decravane's tenosynovitis, that is going to be your forearm-based thumb spica splint. I remember learning from one of the hand therapists at another location where I did my hand therapy OT field work. That was where I made this hand-based thumb spica, and she was kind of talking me through what the protocol may look like for someone with Decravane's and a thumb spica splint. So this is really too small because it was made out of scrap material, but you're going to come down to about 2/3 down the forearm with a forearm base. You're going to start with that in a Decravane's tenosynovitis case example, and as the protocol in the plan of care progresses, you will cut down the splint from that 2/3 down on the forearm to that hand-based. It's going to be just slightly longer than this. This is scrap material again. But forearm-based thumb spica for Decravane's. That is the ultimate textbook answer that it sounds like they'll be looking for, because that's the only answer I've been seeing in MBCOT studying. But I just wanted to share that I learned the general protocol for deck remains and field work. Now for rheumatoid arthritis, again, kind of like what I was talking about with the wrist, you're going to be using your resting hand splint. So just think about your resting hand splint, and the thumb is just kind of in that quote-unquote comfortable position. I'm trying to use the term comfortable lightly, because especially with burns, you don't want the client in a position of comfort, because that's probably going to be the position you don't want them in. But so just kind of think about, so we know the wrist is going to be in that 23 degrees of wrist extension, and that thumb is kind of palmarly, I've never used that word as an adverb, palmarly abducted and kind of in that C shape. I think my thumb could be a little bit out more this way. We made this in class. This is the first split we made as OT students. But yeah, there's that. That's just the positioning of the thumb for rheumatoid arthritis. Osteoarthritis is going to be that hand-based thumb spica that I had on a moment ago, and I'm going to put it on again. The great thing about the hand-based thumb spica, which you could probably arguably use this for RA too, maybe, I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. I would like to look into the evidence about that. But the hand-based thumb spica is really great for joint protection, as a joint protection strategies, because it really helps you to write. You can just place your marker or your pencil in your hand if it's nicely in that crescent, nicely in this first web space here, and you can be ready to write. I will demonstrate it on the whiteboard, because writing on a whiteboard facilitates wrist extension, as we know from pediatrics and handwriting. But let me go ahead and do that actually, just so you can see. Osteoarthritis, hand-based thumb spica split, and you can easily write with it on. Actually, I'm not writing easily on the whiteboard because I'm not trying to rest my arm on the whiteboard because I don't want to erase anything. But that is the point with that. An example of using a hand-based thumb spica is in the case of a CMC joint replacement. Obviously this one's too small because my CMC is all the way down here, and this becomes a restriction splint in the case of CMC joint replacement. I can easily move my thumb. I mean, more so the wrist, but the CMC is part of the CMC is the wrist. So you'll want to make sure you truly have it in appropriate size. And then UCL and RCL injuries, that stands for ulnar collateral ligament and radial collateral ligament. So you can use a hand-based thumb spica splint for that as well. But I also learned a couple splints that sounded kind of new to me were a figure 8 orthosis for the thumb and a thumb loop splint. Or it's not a splint, it's a prefabricated thing. Based on my understanding and my studying, it seems that a thumb loop is just the prefabricated version of the hand-based thumb spica. So you can really use either one of those three there. And I do want to go ahead and make this note here. I have found 3 different types of figure 8 splints that are available, and they can, I think one of them is prefabricated, but that one's at the end. But there are 3 different types of figure 8 splints. There's the one that I already knew about. That's the figure 8 splint can be used interchangeably with oval 8 splints. My understanding is that oval 8 splints are the prefabricated version of figure 8 splints. Figure 8 splints are going to be custom fabricated. Not that it's much easier, not that it's very hard to fabricate at all. Well, it might depend on the person, but that probably just comes out with the client factors and client differences. But a figure 8 orthosis, whether it is for the PIP joint in the swan neck deformity or boutonniere deformity, or a figure 8 orthosis for a UCL or RCL injury, is to support is to provide stability to the I think it specifically said stability to the IP joint. However, I feel like it would also help support the MCP joint because the nature of an ulnar or radial collateral ligament injury is to